Welcome to the Snowbirds US Day Tracker webinar. Today's topic is your Welcome to Canada US Snowbirds What If Checklist, Problems and Planning Solutions. Your esteemed hosts for this webinar are Gerry Scott, founder of the Snowbirds US Day Tracker, and David Luzon, partner at Barclay Damon. Gerry is an experienced advisor specializing in cross-border solutions. He has also hosts the Snowbirds US Expats radio podcast and is a snowbird just like you. David is a trust and estate and wealth planning attorney with over 25 years of experience, and he's based in Buffalo, New York. If you have a question during this webinar, there's a Q&A utility in Zoom, and you can use that and ask away, and we'll field all questions at the end of the webinar. And now, here's your hosts, Gerry and David.
Well, thank you, everybody, for joining. Applause, Mike. Thank you, everybody, for joining our first. We have the podcast, which we've been doing for quite a while now, and we've been asked to do these webinars. And David got the short straw, and he's the first up. So we were going to be discussing a lot of the issues for Canadian snowbirds that have these properties down south, and some of the problems that they've run into. And we really want to treat this as more of about a case study. We find that if we go into the details of what went wrong, and trust, the biggest thing is when things do go wrong, they get very expensive. So the whole takeaway from this podcast, from this webinar, which will also be a podcast, will make sure that you get the information, you can reach out to David, and you get yourself set up properly. We've always said that this podcast, these webinars we do, it's really about connecting people with the right people. So it's about connections and education. So, David Luzon, welcome to the show. Welcome to the webinar, and the stage is yours.
Thank you, Gerry. Appreciate it. And Toronto Mike, lovely to have you on board and kind of running things for us in the background and the foreground. Thank you. Gerry, I can't thank you enough. I've really enjoyed making your acquaintance over the last couple of years and working with you on a couple of client matters and in general, discussing the snowbird problems and issues that come up. And so I'm going to take a little bit of time just to give a little bit of background. Somebody should be able to kick me. I wish you could, because I tend to get a little technical, but I will definitely try to not get too technical today. And we will focus on, like Gerry said, some of the real life scenarios that I faced in the cross-border planning and cross-border administration areas. I say the administration areas because there's nothing like having to try to fix a problem in administration to tell us or inform us of what we should be doing on the planning side. So if only these people had planned a little bit, they could have avoided the administration nightmares. So I will go over some of those scenarios. So what if each of the clients in the following scenarios had undertaken some proper planning, right? That's kind of what we're talking about today. Gerry came up with the what if kind of format of this, and I think it's fantastic. And one of the biggest things, what if they hadn't procrastinated or ignored the issues? We all tend to put stuff off and procrastinate. I'm a really big procrastinator. It does solve a lot of problems, but when it doesn't solve a problem, it can turn out to be a real disaster. So don't be like me. Just a little bit of background. We're going to talk a little bit about U.S. income tax and U.S. estate and gift tax. So Gerry, has Snowbird US Day Tracker and the whole snowbirds practice, and a lot of that practice has to do with income tax, but a lot of it has to do with estate and gift tax in the US too. And so we're going to kind of talk about some of those issues. This is the most technical we're going to get. It's a couple of slides, and then we're going to launch right into some scenarios. So U.S. income tax, right, applies to, we're only talking about non-citizens, right, not living in the U.S., so snowbirds, right? U.S. income tax applies to non-citizens and they're subject to U.S. income tax on U.S. source income. So if you have something in the U.S., a business that generates income that pays it to you out of the U.S., you have to pay U.S. income tax on that income. But you're also subject to U.S. income tax on your worldwide income if you become a tax resident of the U.S. by going over the 183 days, right? So everybody watches their day count. The biggest point that I can make in this seminar is that that's an income tax rule. It's not an estate tax rule. It has nothing to do with U.S. estate tax. So you'll see in a little bit that they're completely different. So it doesn't matter if you stay out of the U.S. for over 183 days. If you own something in the U.S., you're still going to be subject to the estate tax rules. U.S. gift and estate tax. So this is kind of what we're going to focus on a bit today. A resident non-alien, probably not most of you that are watching this today because you're snowbirds, you're probably considered non-resident aliens of the U.S. But if you were resident in the U.S., you would be entitled to a very large exemption, just like a U.S. citizen. But more likely, we're talking about the second category here, the non-resident, non-citizen. You're estate taxed only on U.S. situs assets. So if you own a piece of property in Florida, in Arizona, in California, in Texas, that's considered a U.S. situs property, and your estate is going to be subject to U.S. estate tax on that when you pass away. The top rate is about 40%, very high. And then the exemption is extraordinarily low, only $60,000. And so 40% on the value over $60,000 adds up really, really quickly. Luckily, the Canada and US love each other. And we have a tax treaty that's been in place for a long time, which allows Canadian states to have an increased treaty benefit and reduce or eliminate that tax. But there's a lot of technical rules that go along with that. And though you're going to see in some of the scenarios that are coming right up, when people don't take charge of their planning and they run afoul of those rules, they can end up paying a lot of US estate tax. Okay. Like I said, there's a treaty. You can get the increased exemption for your estate, but your estate has to file a 706NA, which is an estate tax return with the U.S. government, and it has to be filed timely, so within 9 months of the date of death. It's invasive and costly. You have to value your worldwide assets, and there are potential penalties and interest. So let's get right to the horror stories. So, are we trying to scare you? Yes, we're trying to scare you into action, whether it's with Gerry and I or another, valued, trusted, advisor that really understands the rules. So here come the scary stories. So you can see from the slide, right? And I don't know if we're making these available for the participants or not, but I'm not going to read to you verbatim, but you can follow along on the slide. Joe and Rita were snowbirds and they owned a place in Florida. Joe had a stroke, and this is a real life story. I didn't make any of these up. Each one you're going to see is really from my practice. They were older. They lived in Ontario. They had their place in Florida. Joe had a stroke. And they returned to Ontario, and they were never going to go back to Florida. It was just too hard. He couldn't travel anymore. She didn't want to go without him, so they decided to sell the place in Florida. He couldn't sign anything. He was impaired after his stroke, so she attempted to use her Canadian power of attorney. They were great. They did their Canadian estate planning, and they thought they were all set. But they tried to use that Canadian power of attorney to close the Florida sale of the property. And the title company refused to honor the Canadian power of attorney. And this actually went up to one of the courts in Florida, and the court basically upheld the title company and said they didn't have to accept it because it was prepared outside the country. And so this poor client of Joe and Rita, of course, are, made up names. But here, Rita had to bring a guardianship proceeding over her own husband to get a court to tell the world, basically, that she had the legal authority to sign documents for him so they could sell the house in Florida. It was extraordinarily long proceeding. It was invasive. It was very costly. And the cost of having had Florida powers of attorney prepared and ready to go if they ever needed them would have been incredibly helpful. And so, for almost all of my cross-border planning clients, I advise them, even if they don't need US wills from me or other documents, I'm saying to them, you should have powers of attorney in the state where you spend any time. You can leave them in your house in Florida. You don't have to take them back and forth. Just leave them there in case you need them there. But if you need them, they're there, they're ready to go. They can avoid a guardianship. So are we going to wait until the end on questions or questions per kind of subject? How do you want to handle that?
At the very end, I'll ask you all the questions I've collected.
Okay, excellent. And so in the next scenario, what if Jane had gotten rid of that revocable trust? So in this scenario, Jane and John, husband and wife, she's Canadian, he's US, a mixed marriage, as we say sometimes now, right? Different citizenships, mixed citizenships. They lived in Florida for a number of years and near John's mother, Gemma. Gemma was a US citizen only. And as part of her estate planning in Florida, this is really very typical. Florida residents almost always use a revocable trust for their planning because the cost of probate there is exorbitant. It takes a long time. The attorney's fees are extraordinarily high. And so most Floridians tend to avoid having to use a will and going through the probate process. So they use a revocable trust. They put assets into it. They run it for their lives. And then when they die, it goes out to their beneficiaries. Gemma had put a Florida residence into this revocable trust. And during her life, she lived there. And on her death, it went to Jane and John. Well, they continued to live in Florida for a little while. And then unfortunately, John started getting some dementia and they moved back to the Toronto area. Actually, Jane's family has a business in the Toronto area, so she had family there. She felt better equipped to help and care for John with family around her. So they moved back to Toronto to be around her family. But she had the revocable trust still running. She was a trustee of it. She was a beneficiary of it. And over a number of years, it caused about $50,000 Canadian of really negative income tax consequences. Her income tax advisor, her accountant, finally, said, look, we've got to do something about this. And so they hired me to help unwind the trust and get rid of it for her. So had she done this earlier on, she would have been able to avoid all of the negative income tax consequences. And now that it's been in place so long, there are some gift tax consequences too that are a little not so great. The lesson there is that if you have a revocable trust they're fine while you're resident in the United States, but if you move back to Canada, they can cause all kinds of problems. Okay, so on to our next example. This is one that I'm dealing with right now, and it's really kind of an awful story. Carol, she's Canadian only, owned a home in Florida worth about $1 million. And she died in October of 2022, late October. Carol's daughters, Carly and Cassie, consulted with their Canadian estate attorney, right? They needed to probate her will in Canada. She had a Canadian home. She had all kinds of Canadian assets. And so they consulted a Canadian attorney. As a clue to what's coming, I've named him Manny Malpractice. So Manny probated Carol's will and helped the daughters to settle her estate. He advised Carly and Cassie to not worry about any of the US estate issues until the Canadian estate was settled. So this was a critical mistake because as I said earlier on, any real property inside the U.S. is a U.S. situs asset subject to U.S. estate tax. And the rules for filing that 706NA, the estate tax return, are such that it has to be filed within 9 months of the date of death. So by the time they called me and knew that they had a problem, they were well past the 9-month mark. They could have qualified for a 6-month extension of time, but that request for the extension would have had to be filed before the 9 months was up. So they missed both the filing date and the request for an extension date. And, since the deadline was missed, it's now in the discretion of the Internal Revenue Service whether or not to grant them the increased treaty exemption. So we filed it about 6 months ago. I don't expect to hear anything for about 8 months to a year. And I don't know if the IRS is going to come back and say they owe $400,000 worth of tax, or if the IRS is going to come back and say, we'll grant the increased exemption. We won't charge the $400,000 worth of tax, but we're going to charge penalties and interest because you failed to file on time. So stay tuned. Maybe we'll have a follow-up to get to that. The point being, if you think you have anything in the US, you should really get the right information as quickly as possible. And I think Gerry would encourage you to plan. That's kind of one of the main thrusts of this conversation is had Carol, contacted a cross-border attorney, while she was alive, they could have been ready to go when she died, and the daughters wouldn't have had been burdened, right, with having to figure out the rules, having to figure out that they already missed the deadlines, filed late, and may be subject to tax, penalties, and interest. Okay, so on to the next one. So, we all love a good DIY project, but not when it comes to tax. You really, really don't want to do it when it comes to tax, particularly international tax. So Giuseppe's wife, Giovanna, both Canadian, died. Wife died. Giuseppe's still alive. She owned 3 rental properties in Florida. And somehow the daughter, who is the executor of mom's estate, was able to sell the 3 rental properties. But before the attorneys who were representing the buyer would release any, they figured out they had a problem. I think they had a real epiphany. I think they got really scared is what happened, because they're U.S. attorneys and they understand that they are holding the proceeds of sale of a property that may be subject to estate tax. And our U.S. estate tax rules make the person or company in possession of the funds personally liable for the tax. So these attorneys, I think, got really scared, and they realized that they're going to be on the hook personally for the tax if they release the funds from the sale of the properties to the estate. The estate could go off and do whatever they want, and then the attorneys would be personally on the hook. So now the attorneys are requiring that Giovanna's daughter, the executor of her estate, file a 706NA, the U.S. estate tax return, and pay any estate tax that may be due. Well, that's kind of a typical day of the week for me, right? Dealing with those problems. But as we looked into filing this estate tax return, there's a question on the estate tax return that says, did the decedent make any prior gifts of any U.S. property? And when we reviewed the U.S. deed transfer records in Florida, we found that mom had given one property to her daughter, one property to her son many years ago, back in 2018. And so those were gifts that should have been recorded, tax should have been paid. And now we can't really file the 706NA, the estate tax return, until we report those gifts, which means we have to hire a valuation company to go back in time, look at the records, figure out how much those condos were worth back in 2018, write a certified appraisal so that we can attach those to the estate tax return. And there's going to be gift tax, penalties, interest, and estate tax due on those transfers. They could have avoided all of that with proper planning. Oh, and this is, I think this is the last one. Yeah. So this is the last scenario. And I will tell you that I included this because it's an interesting case. It has nothing to do with Canadian citizenship, but I know there are a lot of Canadians or people who live in Canada that are not necessarily Canadian citizens. So this could be applicable. It might not be, but you could come across this situation. So Nancy, who was born in Chile, lived in Chile for many years, moved to New York City. And if you think back to the beginning of the presentation, when someone lives there, they have the increased exemption that a US citizen would be entitled to that would generally eliminate estate tax for most people. So she lived there for many years. She purchased a condo there. She consulted with a New York City estate planning attorney, and he had her put it into a revocable trust. So she put the condo into a revocable trust, which will avoid probate, which everybody wants to do, but has no advantage for tax consequences whatsoever. And he said she'd be fine. And she was fine because she lived in the US and she had the increased exemption, no estate tax. She moved back to Chile without the intent to ever return to the United States. And she kept the condo and rented it out. She paid her income tax every year, but she had recurrent cancer, unfortunately. And she consulted with us to make sure that her planning was in order. She wanted to make sure because she has a 13-year-old daughter. She wanted to make sure this condo was an income source for the daughter for the rest of her life, to send her to college, et cetera, et cetera. And so as soon as I saw the documents, I recognized that since she no longer lived in the US, her estate would be subject to US estate tax on anything over $60,000. At that point, the condo was worth almost $1 million. So she was facing almost $400,000 worth of estate tax. So we crafted a solution to get her out of the estate tax, and it's legitimate. It should be done over a little bit of time. The IRS doesn't like to see things done like date 3 days in a row. Today, I transfer the condo into LLC, then I transfer the LLC to a foreign trust. If we can put a little time between those steps, it's always helpful. But it would have eliminated the estate tax. Unfortunately, Nancy died before she could sign the transfer documents. And now we're representing her estate. We've already paid in almost $200,000 of estate tax to the US IRS. And now we're working on getting the rest of the money to send it in before July 11th of this year. Questions?
So
Well,
David, I'll hit you with the questions from attendees, and I'm sure Gerry has questions as well. But there's a question from another David. So I should tell everybody, this is not this David. You didn't just ask yourself a question, a real David. That would be funny, though. Where would you get a USA power of attorney prepared, in Canada or the USA?
So you should have the United States has 50 different states, right? It should be prepared by an attorney in the state where you would like the power of attorney. There are some firms like mine that can prepare them for several states because we have attorneys licensed in a number of different states. And so, we can prepare a New York power of attorney, a Florida power of attorney, a Massachusetts power of attorney. We've got a number of states that we can do it for.
Now, this one came in anonymously, but can you explain what a ladybird trust is?
I don't practice in Florida, but I have colleagues here that do. I think it's called a ladybird deed, and it is a transfer structure in Florida where you make a deed, and I think you put a beneficiary on it. So if I make a ladybird deed for you, Toronto Mike, it's mine during my life. It's almost like a life estate. I can do anything with the property, but once I die, it automatically goes to you. That's my understanding, but it is more a Florida concept. It's not a New York concept. I can tell you that.
Right. Karen writes in, David, do you handle the legals for both Canada and the US? And does this include estate planning and property sale?
Excellent. Oh, thank you. So the short answer is no. And the other answer is that I partner with Canadian trust and estate attorneys to make sure that the solution works on both sides of the border. So if it's Karen, right? If Karen has a trust and estate attorney in Canada, I would collaborate with that trusted estate attorney to make sure her plan works on both sides of the border. He or she would do any property sale in Canada. We would do any property sale in the US. It's kind of splitting on both sides. There are some attorneys licensed on both sides of the border, but they're far and few between.
Okay, last question before I pass the baton to Gerry. This one is, okay, David, I'm familiar with the day count to avoid US taxes. If I stay below my day count each year, will I be free of any estate tax problems?
No, absolutely not. The the income tax and the estate tax are completely separate systems in the U.S. So if you're below the day count, you'll be free of any income tax problems, but you will always be subject to U.S. estate tax as long as you own something inside the U.S.
Okay, just a wrap up from the David who asked that first question. Says, thank you for the advice. Our U.S. home is in Arizona. So this is the gentleman who was asking about.
I have a good friend and colleague in Arizona that would be happy to work with you on your Arizona powers of attorney and healthcare proxies or whatever you need.
And that's it for questions on the webinar. I pass the baton to Gerry Scott.
Okay, so I mean, I'm going to defend all those Canadian snowbirds out there. I don't know if it's procrastination. I think what happens is when they buy these properties, there's some kind of an emotional event. You go down there, you're with your spouse. And as everybody knows, I spent a lot of time in Maui. And what I see with these folks, these Canadians that buy places in Maui, they just fall in love with the place. And there's these real estate kiosks everywhere. And before you know it, they are buying this place. And they don't know if they're going to buy it personally, they're going to buy it corporately. But it really starts with just this event that's an emotional process. There is no real planning going in place. So then when they buy it and all these questions along the way, and remember, these are realtors that wonderful people that love to sell places, and they don't really have a lot of knowledge about the Canadian buyer. So I think a lot of folks are just triggered to buy this. It's an emotional process. And then it's like taking a power squadron course after you bought the 40-foot boat. You get a little worried and freaked out when you're taking the power squadron course because you start thinking of all these things that could have gone wrong, might have gone wrong, or we have to prepare for. So I'm going to defend all those Canadian snowbirds out there that we get it. But before things get too bad or a terrible event occurs, our process of this, myself being a snowbird as well, and having great colleagues like David, we can reach out to them, and it's always about connections and it's about education, and that's all we're doing at the Snowbird US Day Tracker. Yes, I am an advisor, a cross-border advisor, but we always make sure we don't solicit anybody. It's just there to help everybody. And the amount of information that I've learned over the last 10, 15 years of spending so much time in the States. But the other thing that I want people to know is that just make sure that you probably have a problem that you're not aware of. May it be a POA, power of attorney. So the idea of this podcast is just to make sure that there are probably errors that you're not familiar with, and that's why we got David. Now, going forward as well, we have, and Mike, maybe you can, we have a little bit of a survey on the podcast as well. We've given you 5 choices of what you would like to see on the next podcast. And I took these five ideas for seminars, and these have become some of the most important podcasts that we've done. And how we measure a podcast is the amount of viewers that we have and the amount of questions that I get back. And I have made my cell phone available, and we get a lot of calls. And it's great because on a Saturday, Sunday morning, I get some calls, and I love to return people's calls as quick as I can. On the weekends, I tend to be a little slower Monday to Friday. So Toronto Mike, let people know about that survey and those seminars that we'd like to know in what order or what should be the next one.
Okay, yeah, you're surprising me here, but I'm going to have a great answer for you in a moment here. So it is a Zoom webinar survey. I'm not sure it's live for this particular one, but it's all set to go. And I'm going to quickly tell you what they are. So see, here I am, quick on my feet. Okay. So there's 5 options, and we're very interested in what are the most desired seminar topics. One is the 30-day myth. Does my I-94 reset when I return to Canada from the US and then re-enter the US? So this is your first topic. And again, I'll have a Zoom link. Maybe we'll be able to send it to everybody so they can just pick which one they want. But second one, should I renounce my US citizenship? Third one, is there such a thing as a 12-month rolling calendar for retired snowbirds? Fourth one, buying or selling US real estate / property from a snowbird's perspective. And then the final one that we're considering, mistakes to avoid when moving back to Canada. So this will be the survey, and we'll get a link to everybody so they can pick their preferred upcoming topic, and then we'll get that fed back to us so we can please everybody.
And a quick reminder that this podcast is being recorded, podcast webinar. It is being recorded. We will make it available. You can go on to Spotify and go on to Snowbird Expat Radio Podcast will be available there. And we'll have this available as well. I think there will be a feature, a notification on the app that allows you to share this podcast webinar with friends, and because all these snowbirds are connected, all these expats are connected. So we will make that available for everybody. So, and keep in mind, it's not just for snowbirds. There's a lot of Americans that move up to Canada. Either they marry a Canadian person or they have some ties to Canada. So they do move back and forth. So this has kept David and I very, very busy in our real lives.
Can
David,
I slip in
go ahead,
I'm
Mike.
so sorry to interrupt there, but there's a couple of late breaking questions.
Oh,
There's
there
a lot
we
of
are. I see
activity
that.
here. Okay. So Karen was wondering, when tracking your days as a snowbird in the USA, why do you have to include the previous 2 years?
Well, I will answer that question. It doesn't, it's, I don't know how they came up with the formula. So basically you got the current year, which is going to be a full year, and the 2-year look back. The first year is 1/3 of those days you calculate and you carry forward to the current year. And the second year look back is 1/6. And they've come up with this really crazy formula. So it's 1/6, 1/3, and a full day. And that's where David said that if you want to avoid being deemed a US citizen for tax purposes.
Resident,
a US resident for tax purposes. So and this is why we designed the app in the first place, you take all those days, and if you exceed 183 days, you want to fill out the closer tie connection form, which is the 8840, and you file it down to Austin, Texas. People say that it's hard to find out where to send it, but I think it's on the 4th page. There's a little section, very tiny, that says Austin, Texas, and here is the zip code. But that is very, very important. I think that's another one of those things that Canadian snowbirds like to do. They like to put their head in the sand, and they're afraid to fill out this form and fire it down. And the answers are very simple. Canada, 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 Canada. Where do you vote? Where's your main residence? Where's your church? All these things. So it's just important to make sure that you're 100% compliant, because as David mentioned, if you plan ahead, it's very, very cost effective. If you don't plan, it's expensive. So now these questions are lighting up the board. David, you got another 6 hours left in your day?
yeah, sure, no problem.
Okay, so go ahead.
Well, okay, a funny remark from David. He says, if I could fill out the form, anyone can fill out the form. So there's some positive news from David. And he's kind of does LOL. He goes, is that 30? I think it's 30 day, but he writes, is that 30 reset thing myth or the truth?
Well, here's the thing with immigration. When you go across the border, The biggest thing that the border crossing agents are looking for is, what is your intent? So when you people talk about this 30-day myth, we don't know if it exists because it is at the discretion of the border crossing agent's judgment. So if you go home, a lot of snowbirds go home because the kids are there, the grandkids are there. They go home for Christmas and then they go back into the United States. And it could be 30 days. So we always encourage people that you can go to the Snowbirds website. Snowbirds, it's called Snowbirds US Day Tracker website. And there's there's an area there called I-94. You can click on it and you can check out your travel history and you'll see if they actually reset it. And you'll go onto their website and you just request your I-94 and keep an eye on it, because it really does become a little bit of a problem, because you could be in the country if they don't grant that new I-94, that 30 days will be seen as you being deemed in the country from an immigration point of view, not from a tax perspective, but from an immigration point of view. So you want to keep an eye on it, and feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions regarding the 30-day myth. A lot of people believe that we don't have a clue, actually. It's at the discretion of the border crossing agent.
So you mentioned reach out if anyone has questions. So let me give David's contact info, and then Gerry, you give yours. But for David, you can phone him 716-566-1527. You can call him up, or you could write him an email, Luzon. So DLU, in here in Canada, I'm going to say Z. Okay. DLUZON as in Norman at barclaydamon.com. BARCLAYDAM as in Mike, ON as in Norman.com. So you can contact David anytime. Back to you, Gerry.
Okay, I really appreciate the people that are going to get some Snowbird mugs are Karen and David for their participation in the questions. But Karen asked a question: does anybody understand, or the question is, does anybody have a feel for the Snowbird visa? So what Karen is talking about is this extended stay in the United States. And I've tried to reach out. There's a governor from Arizona, and I think there's a governor from New York that's trying to really push this this visa through, and it's been talked about for years. And really, what it comes down to is that kind of snowbird age 55 or older spend more than 6 months, 182 days in the United States. And I know when David met myself in Maui for lunch at Mama's Fish House. Big shout out for Mama's Fish House if you're ever in Maui. It's the greatest restaurant arguably anywhere. It's such a great setting. This comes up a lot because there's tax implications about the 183 current year and the 2-year look back. There's immigration issues. There's healthcare issues with the province, depending on what province you're from. I get it that the United States would love to have snowbirds down there spending more money, and we spending more time there, all of us spending more time. I've reached out. I tried to get these two senators on our podcast. No one wants to expose themselves to coming up with truthful answers, I guess. But I know it's in the works. I don't know how it's going to work. David, anything you want to add to that?
We haven't heard anything about it being implemented or close to being implemented, so it's really just on hold at the moment, as far as we know.
So stay tuned. Yeah, and hopefully we can get some other folks. We've got some really exciting podcasts coming out in the next few months. A lot of folks that are participating that have homes in Maui. There's the governor and the mayor, Richard Bisson is his name. They're trying to eliminate short-term rentals. There's about 7,000 units they're trying to take off the market. We've reached out to, there's a great a real estate lawyer that I introduced to David, Clay Sutherland.
Oh, yeah.
He's doing a lot of research on the history of that grandfathered law and what's going to happen going forward. But sadly, Maui is has some serious problems that they're trying to work through, from affordable housing, education, healthcare, high inflation. So we're trying to get some great guests to kind of work through that as well too. So But other than that, do we have any other more questions? No, we don't. So I think on that note, I appreciate everybody. We look forward to your follow-up on the next webinar that we do. These webinars, they do go through the Snowbird US Day Tracker app, their notifications. They allow you to subscribe to these podcasts. And once again, I know we've got David's phone number as 716-566-1527. And that's D Luzon at barclaydamon.com. You can reach out to David. You can reach out to myself. It's Gerry at snowbirdsusdaytracker.com. And we will always point you in the right direction. We've been fortunate to meet a lot of great people like David right across the United States and Canada. And Snowbirds, we are I was going to say we're a group, but technically we're a flock, if that is a real word. And I said flock. A flock of birds that love to go down south, and we go down for all the right reasons. It's our happy place, warmer weather. It helps with the arthritis, and the golf is affordable at times. So we thank you for your time, and please reach out if we have any other questions. If you have questions, we look forward to getting back to you. So thank you, David.
Gerry, thanks so much. Appreciate being your first webinar. Very much so. Thank you.
Yes, and you'll be on the podcast many times more, I'm sure. And Toronto Mike, as always, thank you for your expertise. And we will continue to educate this audience, this cross-border audience. And we end every podcast, every webinar with, please remember, the world is small and be kind to all.